African scene, and they were dealing with a water buffalo. And one particular thing, and this has something to do here with you and I, making sure we stick together against Satan. If we know he's our enemy and he's that roaring lion, they had one particular scene where the lion got a hold of the buffalo by the throat and had it down on the ground. And the other water buffalo were surrounding it. And I was watching that, and they were just gouging their fellow buffalo. And I thought, now what's that all about? You know, it's almost like they're trying to finish it off. And the one on the ground that the lion had would try to get up, and he'd lay back down, and the lion had that grip on his throat. And they'd gouge him again, and he'd try to get up again. And finally, 2 or 3 of them gouged him, and he got up. And when the buffalo got up, it changed the trajectory of the lion's grip on the buffalo. Now the lion's hanging and the buffalo's up, and they turn on the lion, and they start gouging it. You know, now all of a sudden the lion looks around, and all these water buffalo with these horns are aimed at him. And guess what he does? He runs off. And I thought, boy, there's a lesson in that, isn't it? When I was first seeing that, sometimes we just have to gouge each other. Say, look, we got an enemy. You don't give in to it. Don't lay down. Get up. And they were in essence saying, get up. You're going to have to help us out here. We can't, if we try to get the lion here, we're going to finish you off. So you get up and you help us help you. And I thought there was a valuable lesson in that. And that becomes really important for us to pay attention to. Who tempted Eve to sin? All right, Satan. We can learn from that, can't we? Not allow Satan to have a casual conversation with us. Sometimes we just dabble in that and say, well, just a little bit of pornography on TV. It's not a big deal. And, I know that was an off-color joke, but, that's just not a big deal. We don't need to be having casual conversations with our adversary, should we? And so she was having a conversation. She didn't know he was the enemy at that point, evidently. As Jerry pointed out, she seemed to be comfortable enough talking to the serpent. And who tempted Cain? And what did he tempt Cain to do? All right. And you remember the Lord said to Cain, sin crouches at the door. How does sin crouch at the door? Our adversary crouches at the door, doesn't he? And so he had been tempted to kill his brother, and those things are important to remember. What did the devil take away from Job? And this is what we'll talk about today in our lesson. All right, everything but his life. That's the short answer, isn't it? And everything but his life. And the Lord put that parameter on it. You can do that, but you can't take his life. And so his wealth and his health and his family in the first 2 chapters of Job. How did the devil tempt Jesus? How many times? 3 times. In what ways? All right? Lust of the flesh, lust of the eye, and pride of life, which is turn the stone to bread, jump off of this pinnacle, and worship me. And those were areas that Jesus was tempted in. Yet the Hebrew writer says, yet without sin. He didn't give in to them. How did he ward off Satan? It is written. See how important it is for us to not let Satan snatch that word out of our heart? If he does that, you don't have the scriptures to say it is written, do you? See how important it is for us not to let Satan starve it to death because our soil of our heart's too shallow? Because then when it really gets tough and we got to reach down deep, it's just not there. And in fact, it describes that stony ground. When the sun came out, it kind of withers away. Don't have any depth, don't have any roots. See how important it is for us not to have temptation to do worldly things? Hey, you can have all these kingdoms. Just bow down and worship me. That's a temptation to some folk. Boy, if I could just have what everybody else has in this world. And so Satan still operates that way, doesn't he? The devil entered Judas's heart and did what? Caused him to do what? Wow, that's about as hideous as we can think. We use that frequently, don't we? If somebody betrays us, we'll say, he's just a Judas. How do you like for your name to be synonymous with betrayal? And see what Satan can do. He can get us so focused on material things or selfish things that we don't stay focused on the spiritual thing.
Jerry, Judas is an example of how if we do little, what we might call petty sins, it can lead us to greater sins, because Judas had the money for Jesus and his disciples, yet he stole from it periodically, apparently.
Yep.
Because they agreed, it led him to betray Jesus.
Yeah, that's a good point. Brother Joe's talking about the progressive nature of Judas's sin. He's holding the money for Jesus and his disciples, and because of that covetousness or that materialism that filled his heart, eventually it led him to betray Jesus. For what reason? 30 pieces of silver, more money. Remember even arguing about why we wasting this money, letting this woman waste this oil to anoint the Lord when, well, we could sell it and feed the poor. And it said that's not why he wanted to sell it, not feed the poor, but he's a thief. And so who tempted Ananias and Sapphira to sin? Well, he's busy, isn't he? Every dark place in the Scripture, you have Satan there. And in Acts chapter 5, many positive things happening in the church, and it was growing and flourishing, and people being sacrificial. And Satan tempted them to lie about what they sold their property for. And Peter knew it, and he called them into account. The devil sowed what? Tares. And it said the tares, when it gives the interpretation, are the children of the devil. And so he produces offspring, and his offspring become the tares in the field. And so we mentioned in our sermon dealing with that, we have to not only outknow them, but we have to, outsow them and outgrow them. All right, 1 John 3 and verse 8 says what? All right, he that committeth sin is of the devil. And so we kind of know how that connects us to him. So that brings us up to where we are. I wanted to expose you to that, and then we'll take up and give a few more facts. And Jerry will go over your answer sheet Wednesday night. So when you think about Mark chapter 4, when he talks about the parables of the sower, it describes the bird of the air. I don't know about you, but Denise and I have bird feeders. We like watching the birds, but it doesn't take them long to empty that thing. I mean, they're out, and I can remember being on the farm, and we'd plant our crops, and the birds would line up on the fence at the turning row. And boy, if you didn't cover those seed up, some of them fell on the turning row or down in the middle, then they would fly down there and get it. And so I have an immediate image of what Satan does, like that bird, fetching that before it ever has a chance to penetrate. So I have to be aware that as those birds remove the seed, Satan can remove the word, and that's a serious matter. I can't allow it to just stay on the surface. I have to make sure it's buried in the good soil. And that's lest the word take root. He doesn't want it to spring up and bear what God had designed for it to. He didn't want Adam and Eve to enjoy the the communion with God. He didn't want them to enjoy the intimacy that they had with the Lord in the garden. And so he interrupted that with a sin, and that he doesn't want us to have that relationship to God. So how does he keep us from God? He keeps us away from the Word, or the Word away from us. And so we have to make sure we spend some time in the Word and make sure the Word spends time in us, and we don't allow Satan to take it out. He steals that Word from man's heart and keeps them in bondage. You know, you act like you're going to be free. Oh, you eat of that tree, and you're going to be God. Well, were they? No, it cost them everything. And so the same is true today. You look at passages like Romans chapter 6 and verse 16 and following, it describes that past life we had and the present life. You know, you once were the servants of sin, but you've obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered you. Being then made free from sin, you became the servants of righteousness. That freedom is only through the obedience to that word. You obeyed from the heart. There's that soil again, isn't it? You obeyed from the heart, that form of doctrine. There's that word again, isn't it? That form of doctrine which was delivered you. You allowed that to penetrate your heart. You were obedient to it, and guess what? It freed you from sin. What happens if you're not obedient to it? You're going to stay enslaved to sin. What does Satan want you to do? Stay enslaved to sin. So he wants to take that word out of your heart. So that becomes an important for us to pay attention to. Remember, Jesus said in John chapter 8, verse 31 and 32, to those Jews who believed on him, he said, listen carefully, if you continue in my word, then are you my disciples indeed, and you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And you had people who listened to Satan and not to the Lord. Said, we're Abraham's seed. We have never been in bondage to any man. That's the context where Jesus said, you are of your father, the devil. He's been a murderer, a liar from the beginning, and you're falling for his lies, and you're allowing him to take your life. If you continue in my word, you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. But Satan knows that, so he wants to remove that word. Those people had their hearts calloused, didn't they, to what Jesus was teaching. So as a roaring lion, he walketh about seeking whom he may devour, and we want to make sure that we withstand that. All right, let's drop down, if you will, with me to looking at the details of really probably be card number 12 on your list. Billy Wayne pointed this out earlier, but Satan tempted Eve with the lust of the flesh. It was good for food, you remember? And the lust of the eye, it looked pleasant to the eye. And the pride of life, it to make one wise. And so that's how he tempted her. And when Jesus was tempted, same approach. The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life. And though Eve, and that is through Eve, sin entered the world, and what are you and I dealing with? The consequence of sin. We don't inherit Adam and Eve's sin, but we've been separated from the tree of life. Cain's progressive nature and his sin was he didn't obey God in how he worshiped. And part of the reason we know that is that not only the context of Genesis 4, but you look at Hebrews chapter 11, it said, by faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than did Cain. How does faith come? Romans 10:17 said by the word of God. So whatever God instructed him to do, Abel did it. Cain didn't. And so instead of saying, okay, I'll go back and do that right, and being pleasing to God, he became jealous of God's pleasure over the sacrifice that Abel had offered. And then that jealousy led him to hate, and that hate took him to the point where he would take Abel's life. What did that change in Cain's sacrifice? Did God say, oh, since I don't have Abel anymore to offer that sacrifice, and offer what you want to? It doesn't change anything, does it? In his relationship with God, he's still displeasing to God because he hadn't done what God told him to do. Yes, sir.
There's another, to me, another aspect of that.
All right.
Possibly true. We're taught in the New Testament to give, to be prosperous, and to be cheerful. Well, Cain was a tiller of the soil. Abel,
Mm-hmm.
Well, Cain gave of what he had. Now, I don't know exactly what the Lord told him to do, but Abel did willingly and gladly, evidently. Cain
Yep.
evidently did not. He was
Yep.
grudging. Even though he did it, it wasn't because he was a
Yeah. Well, attitude certainly involved, but I think from the passage in Hebrews chapter 11, instructions was involved too, because whatever Abel did, he did by faith. And that made his sacrifice more acceptable than Cain's. He did it by faith. That whole chapter of 11 is God told people what to do, and they did it. So you can't really take that out and say, well, maybe if it's just an attitude, he's a farmer, so what he's supposed to do. When you look at the Old Testament, not all of them had flocks and herds, but they had to have a sacrifice. What did Jesus do at the temple when he became angry with them taking advantage of folks and setting up their money-changing tables at the temple? What were they doing?
They wrote the charge to people because they traveled hundreds of miles maybe and didn't have things. The Lord had set up the law of Moses that they could purchase or whatever.
All right. All right. And so they were told to sacrifice. Maybe not all of them raised a sacrifice. Maybe not all of them had lambs. And so you could see in that they could purchase that. And so whether Cain was a farmer or not, and here's a key, and I think this is the part you can't leave out, is what has God always required for our mind to be focused on when it comes to a sacrifice for sin? It takes a blood sacrifice. What did Abel offer? A blood sacrifice. What did Cain not offer? He brought the best of his flock. And so if it came by faith, and there again, that's Satan. God said, this is what you do. And Satan said, you don't have to do that. So I think an attitude is involved. He certainly had the wrong attitude. We see the evidence of that and how he responded, but I think it has to be the fact that God had told him what to do. He didn't just leave it up to them to do it. Yes?
When the priests were given instructions on how to do the peace offering and their, the offering for sin and everything that they were supposed to do for babies, it was an explicit way to be done for each and every one of them.
Right.
It wasn't the same thing for every one of them.
Yep.
If God didn't leave, well, you can do it this way if you want
Yep.
to, or that way. He told them exactly what he wanted done
Yep.
for this particular sacrifice, for this particular sacrifice. And those priests had to learn
Yep.
which one of those ways that they did so they'd be pleasing to God.
Yep. And I think that's exactly right. But Billy Wayne's talking about when God gave the law, and he gave very specific instruction, very detailed. And they had to do exactly what he told them to do and the way he told them to do it. There again, there's that word. God said, do it. Satan said, you don't have to do it exactly like that. I mean, you don't have to do all that. I mean, doesn't that get a little tedious? Why would he tell you to do that for this occasion and do that for this occasion? And, do you have to do all of it? And the key, obviously, is yes. Now, if you follow all the patriarchs around, that is, the patriarchs that serve God, you're going to see a blood sacrifice being offered. So somewhere in there, God has this consciousness created that man needs to be reminded there's a price to be paid. And yes, there were other sacrifices they offered. They had to give of the first of their flock and the first of their ground, and a lot of that in the Old Testament was to support the priestly tribe so they could eat, because they didn't have property. But those are really good points to ponder. We talked about the details of when we were reviewing the card, we talked about Job and his trials, and he was the greatest of all men of the East, and Satan accused Job of being faithful only because God protected him. And he said, you take that hedge out from around him, and he'll denounce you. And the Lord allowed the hedge to be removed, and he lost his wealth, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 1,000 oxen, 500 female donkeys. He had a great household. He had 10 children. He lost his children. Then he lost his health. He had boils from the bottom of his feet to the crown of his head. And so, unlike Eve and Cain, Job never, ever sinned against God. What does that tell you? Yes, sir.
Back to that card you were talking about Satan stealing the word from your heart. He took everything Job had, he couldn't take it.
Ah, great. That's a great point. Excellent point. He took everything Job had, but Job controlled his heart. He didn't let him in there. Didn't let him take that away. And that lets us have confidence, doesn't it? Don't have to give up. And it gets hard sometimes. Say, look, Lord, the wheels are coming off here. And really, this is happening, now that's happening. And if we're not careful, we can get embittered and say, oh yeah, you're going to serve a God that just allows that to happen? In fact, Job's wife said, just curse God and die and get this over with. And he wouldn't allow Satan to take that word, and that's a great point that Jerry Ray made. He held on to that relationship he had with God, didn't allow Satan to take that out of his heart. And that's what you and I, no matter what happens with our physical and material possessions, we get a choice. If we'll allow Satan into our heart or not. And those parables deal with the kingdom and our relationship with God. We'll talk about another one of those this morning in our stewardship series. Temptation of Christ, we've talked about that. Satan used all three avenues of temptation, and but Jerry did a good job pointing out that we look at it from a divine standpoint and say, how could you tempt God? James 1 said he can't be tempted with evil. So from a divine standpoint, God owns everything. So how could you tempt him by saying, you're hungry, turn stones to bread? But he's fully human. Had to be a temptation to him. If he's going to experience what you and I experience, had to be a temptation to him as a human. He made choices as a human, didn't he? Thirsty, tired, even pled, if there's another way, let this cup pass from me. What cup? I've got to physically suffer. Well, he's God. Why does he have to suffer? Because he became man, took on the form of a servant, and became obedient, even to the death on the cross. So it's a temptation. And we have to assume from a human standpoint, he could have made that choice. It wouldn't have been a temptation. But it's hard for us because we know he's fully God and fully man, and so my mind locks up on me. Like, I don't know how to sort that out. But God sorted it out. He took upon himself that form of a servant, and he was tempted in every point. That's what the Scripture says. He was tempted in every point like as we are, yet without sin. Job went through a lot of those things and didn't sin against God, and so we shouldn't be shocked that Jesus, who is the only perfect one, was able to withstand those things. He overcame sin by using the Scriptures, so you and I are spending time in it. We get to have repetition of these things. And the more of that we learn, the better off we're going to be. And 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13, it said the Lord will not allow us to be tempted above that which we are able to bear. God doesn't provide temptation. James said he doesn't tempt us with evil. And so we're not talking about the evil temptations, we're talking about burdens that we bear in this life. He won't allow us to have more than we can bear. Judas is the one mentioned as being the betrayer of Jesus, and you have listed for you those particular things. And he's most known for his betrayal, but in Matthew chapter 26 and verse 14 and 15, he's described as being covetous. And in Matthew 26, 47 to 49, he is a hypocrite. He went to the Lord and called him friend, kissed him, as if they were really close and intimate when he was betraying him all the time. John 12 and verse 6, he's a thief. That's when we talked about the oil that he wanted to sell for the poor. He was wanted to have the money. John 12 verse 4 through 6 calls him a liar. Well, that tells you whose child he became, doesn't it? You're of your father, the devil. Judas' sin Judas' sin caused him to forfeit his position of honor as an apostle, and be remembered as the greatest traitor who's ever lived. What a swap from an apostleship. You remember when they replaced him in the book of Acts, it said, let his bishopship go to another, and Matthias was chosen. Ananias and Sapphira, we've talked about them in previous lessons in different ways, but what a tragedy that was. So many exciting things where people were selling their possessions and goods and giving to man as different ones as they had need, and they evidently got caught up in that, seeing the recognition that Barnabas got, and they lied about those things. And particularly with Sapphira, you mean she came in, and Peter gave her an opportunity to change her mind, didn't he? They had agreed to lie. And boy, thankfully, if I tried to get Denise to lie with me, she would read me the riot act, you know? But here they agreed to lie. And she stuck with it, didn't she? And he asked her, okay, did you sell it for this? You would be able to see it on my face. You think, you're lying to me just as sure as the world. Not any way in the world I could have pulled that off. And they didn't either, but evidently they convinced themselves they could have. And so a very tragic situation. He calls his the first recorded sin in the church. Boy, he's just there, isn't he? Sin in the garden, sin in this new creation, the spiritual creation, the church. Where's Satan? Messing things up, isn't he? The parable of the tares, we've talked about that in the sermon. We won't spend a whole lot of detail on that. But when you sow the good seed in the soil, you need to realize if you're not vigilant, Satan and his forces will be sowing tares, those things that would take up the nutrient from the heart of man and separate man and give different priorities to man. And so just as the tares are burned at the time of the harvest, the wicked will be burned in hell. We're talking about Satan, the devil, sin in hell. That'll be his final destination. In that last part of that parable of the sower, here's this casting them into this furnace to burn them up. But it said, the sons of the kingdom shall shine as lights. What a contrast. We said we have to outknow them, we have to outsow them, we have to outgrow them. We might even add to that, we have to outglow them, don't we? Here they're shining as lights, like Matthew chapter 6. Let your good works so shine that they may see your good works and glorify the Father who art in heaven. 1 John 3, verse 8, since the beginning Satan was a sinner, and those who sin have the same nature as the devil. And Cain was of the devil. Now he's particularly linked to him in 1 John 3 and verse 12. All others who practice sin are of the devil. So what does that tell me about me if I practice sin? That's right, I'm identified with the devil. And you remember when Peter told Jesus, I'm not going to let you die, not going to happen on my watch. And the Lord said specifically to Peter, get thee behind me, Satan. Well, that's Peter, chosen apostle. He said, what you're saying, you're not going to let me die, contrary to God's will and why I came. Who's trying to get me not to die? Satan. What are you trying to help Satan do? For me not to die. What's going to happen if he doesn't die? Man's going to die in their sins. What does Satan want? So it's all connected. In fact, he said Satan would like to have you and sift you like wheat. Did he sift Peter like wheat? He did, didn't he? All right, that was second bell, and so I'll try to set a good example for Jerry right here and stop.